Okay, thank you very much, Philip. And it's a pleasure then to be here with all of you today to talk then about food supply chains and resilience in food supply chains. In the 16 months since COVID began, how things were prior to COVID, how COVID upended food supply chains, and then looking forward, how those supply chains might evolve and what lessons we can learn then from COVID. As Philip mentioned, I'm a professor at Penn State, been there a long time. The picture that you saw there was an old one. I wish I looked that young right now. I don't, but still glad to be here with you anyway. So next slide, please, Philip. So today then, I'd like to talk about five main things. First of all, what's happened since COVID began. And I'm sure all of us then have our own vivid personal memories of our food producing, food buying experiences, and just kind of build on those to talk about what's happened then in the 16 months then since COVID started. And then second, to talk about what went wrong, because there were a lot of things that went wrong in food supply chains. And I guess as we'll see, it all comes down then to the word resilience and a lack of resilience then in food supply chains, which was exposed by COVID that people were perhaps not aware of or might have had some awareness of, but didn't think that it was that important. Other things took priority prior to COVID. And then third, how companies, how farms, how firms in general adjusted to COVID. You know, what types of changes to supply chains then were made during the course of the pandemic, and how then did those changes lead to where we are now? And then fourth, you know, being a research professor at Penn State, I want to draw on a little bit of research then that I've been involved in on supply chain resilience, focusing in particular then on dairy supply chains. Dairy, I guess, will be kind of the most common theme in terms of all of the agricultural products during the course of my talk here today, primarily because being from Pennsylvania, dairy then is the #1 source then of income then for farmers in Pennsylvania. So the dairy industry is important to Pennsylvania, and hence the focus then of my talk here today. And then finally, some lessons learned about food supply chains and what we could do going forward, what we could do differently, what we perhaps should change, both in terms of farms, in terms of food processing companies, and then governments. Lessons learned then for everyone then involved in food supply chains. Okay, the next slide, please, Philip. So let's begin then by taking a look at what happened during the 16 months then of COVID since the pandemic started here in the United States in March 2020. And really, it's been a roller coaster ride. And I think the situation has changed quite rapidly and quite dramatically then over the course of the pandemic. And we'll see some pictures of that in just a few moments, but you might remember then early in the pandemic, the empty grocery store shelves that we saw for many food products, storable ones in particular, which were cleaned out of grocery stores, and not only food products, but paper products as well. And the adjustments then that the companies made, and the changes then that have occurred in markets and in prices, and we'll talk about all of those things here today. So the next slide, please, Philip. So here we have a couple of pictures then illustrating some of the issues with dairy supply chains early in the pandemic. And although I mentioned then that my focus is on dairy primarily because of its importance then to Pennsylvania, it's certainly an important part of the agriculture of many other states, including Florida. And so the two pictures that you're looking at here right now then are pictures that were taken in Florida. The one on the left, of course, being a grocery store shelf. And the key thing there being kind of there's still some milk products available for sale, but by and large, those shelves are cleaned out, which is certainly not what we expected to see prior to COVID. And what we're not seeing right now, where the grocery store shelves are largely, full to the brim once again then with food products, but they were not then early in COVID, and that included then dairy products such as fluid milk. And at the same time then, we had the issue then of farms dumping milk. And the picture on the right then, again, is a picture from Florida, although you could have taken similar pictures in Pennsylvania and in most other dairy producing states where farms then were dumping milk. And we'll explore then and discuss some of the reasons for that as we kind of move through the talk here today. But I think the key thing is the distinction then between retail markets then for dairy products that are purchased by consumers, such as fluid milk, cheese, butter, and so forth. And then institutional or food service markets then for those products, selling them primarily to restaurants, hotels, schools, including kind of elementary and secondary schools, as well as colleges and universities like Penn State. And the shutdown then in those institutional or food service markets, then leading then to milk, which had nowhere to go, and the widespread dumping of milk that occurred early in the pandemic, this photo then being from April of 2020. Okay, the next slide, please, Philip. And looking at, or one way then to look at the kind of disruption then in dairy supply chains is to take a look at dairy prices then. And here we have prices then at the farm level, which is the line in green, at the wholesale level, which is the darker blue line, and then at the retail level, which is the lighter blue line. All of them scaled then so that they were starting out at a level of 100 then in January of 2020. And then we could see then the changes over time during the pandemic in the prices then of dairy products at these different levels. And the first thing that we could notice with respect to the farm price is the huge drop, the 30% drop that occurred then in farm prices across the United States for dairy, for milk between January of 2020 and May of 2020. And that reflects, again, as I mentioned, the collapse then in the institutional and food service markets then for dairy products. And with that, then the dumping of milk, which had no place to go. And so not only was milk dumped, but the milk that was bought at a significantly lower price with a fairly large discount. However, what you'll notice then at the farm level is that the price rather rapidly recovered, and since then has gone up and down, but has generally stayed within the vicinity of where it was then prior to the start of the pandemic. And so that, I guess, would tell you, and we'll talk about this a little bit more in just a few moments, but that at the farm level, at least, the issues with dairy supply chains early in the pandemic were recovered from fairly quickly. And if we look at the wholesale level, that's the line in darker blue, we can see then that prices at the wholesale level rose early in the pandemic. This reflecting then the demand then for the dairy products that were available at the retail level, the growing demand then for those products, the cleaning out of the shelves like we saw in the picture there before. But that then kind of ran its course by the middle to late summer of last year. And since then, prices have been about where they were at the wholesale level prior to the start of the pandemic. And the third line there, the light blue line representing retail prices, rose a little bit and is a bit higher right now than it was prior to the start of the pandemic, but not significantly higher. And no significant ups or downs then in prices at the retail level compared to the farm or wholesale level. And I think that reflects in large part then the decision, I think, by retailers then to try to hold the line on prices. That, given the choice between raising the price to what consumers were willing to pay, which might have been quite a bit more than what they were paying prior to COVID. So given the choice between that or just holding the line on prices and trying to maintain goodwill then for their customers. By holding the line on prices, they decided then, most grocery store and other retail outlets decided to do that. And so the result then was that the products were cleaned off of the store shelves a bit earlier than they might have if the grocery stores had raised their prices. But nonetheless, they held them in line. Okay, Philip, the next slide, please. This is some illustrations then of what happened in meat supply chains and the disruptions that we saw there. And in meat supply chains, the main issue then, kind of the main choke point, if you want to call it that, with COVID then, was at the meat plant level. Not so much at the farm level, but rather than at the processing plant level. And the figure then on the left shows then some meat plant closures, all of which were temporary, but which ranged kind of in the length of time that they were closed and when they were closed. But all of them illustrate then the disruptions then to meat processing that occurred as a result of COVID. I mean, meat processing plants, I guess, like plants in general, were not designed with social distancing in mind. And so workers then prior to COVID often worked quite closely together along production lines, and that had to change with COVID. It didn't change quite rapidly enough. It has changed now, but it didn't change quite rapidly enough to prevent then the widespread closures then of processing plants, including some in Pennsylvania, again, where I'm from. But with most of that processing, or much of it taking place in the Midwest, then you can see kind of the number of closures that occurred then in the Midwestern states. The picture on the right there is a picture from Pennsylvania, Eastern Pennsylvania, and a grocery store chain called Redner's. And we might all recall what happened then late spring of last year then, when due to the closures then of meat plants, there was rationing then of meat products at the grocery store level. And so people were limited then to buying one pack. In this case here in the picture from Redner's, it was one family pack per family shopping that day. And other grocery stores that implemented similar measures. And some of those grocery stores, although most had changed, I think, at least in Pennsylvania by the summer of 2020, there were some even going into the fall that were still having difficulty getting all the meat that the customers were demanding. And so we're at that point then still rationing meat. Again, the rationing of meat being part of the same story that we talked about before with respect to dairy products, with consumers then unable to go to restaurants or largely to travel and then to stay in hotels and consume food products there. Consumers were purchasing food products at the retail level for use at home, and there just wasn't enough meat, in this case, early in the pandemic to go around, due largely to the meat plant closures, but also then to the issues then with the distinction then between the food service and institutional markets on the one hand, and the products that had gone to them, which in many cases then were kind of in different cuts, different sizes and shapes than those that are typically sold at retail. Okay, Philip, the next slide, please. And this figure then illustrates what happened then during COVID, prior to COVID, and then during and since that in 2020 and then in 2021. And so this is a figure then which is illustrating monthly meat production for 2019, which is the green line, 2020, the blue line, and then 2021 through May of 2021, which is when as far out as the data was available at the time that I prepared this slide, and that line for 2021 being in purple. And as you can see, I mean, there's some seasonality in meat production prior to COVID the dip in production that occurs during February, for example, post-holiday, which occurred then in 2019 and then in 2020 and in 2021. And then the rise or recovery then in production that occurs in March, which happened then in all three of those years. What makes then, and where COVID then was different from the others then, was in the mid to late spring, where you can see with the blue line then monthly meat production in 2020 falling from about 9.3 billion pounds then in March of 2020 to about 7.7 or 7.8 billion pounds in May of 2020. Whereas you don't see that kind of a drop in 2019 or in 2021. And that, again, reflects largely then the closure of meat plants then due to COVID. And so we had, a drop then of more than 20% in monthly meat production during that time. But the meat processing plants, the companies that operate those plants, I think, learned their lessons fairly quickly and quickly made adjustments then to how meat was processed, how workers were spaced along production lines. And so production in 2020 then fairly rapidly recovered to a level a few 100 million pounds below where it had been prior to COVID, but similar then to what had happened then in 2019. And so we saw then with COVID a fairly significant disruption in the mid to late spring in meat production. But by the summer and into the fall then, meat production had recovered to about where it was prior to COVID in 2019, the blue and the green lines there being quite similar to each other. Okay, Philip, the next slide, please. I talked a bit then about the disruptions in food service supply chains, and here it's perhaps we've seen kind of the biggest turnaround that perhaps no one, I think, certainly not myself, would have foreseen taking place so quickly in markets, in food service markets. And so on the left, then we've got a picture then from the spring of 2020, which I think then is of a restaurant, if I'm recalling, then in California, although you could have found pictures like this in any state with restaurants then that were closed then under emergency orders which were put out. And then in the lower part of the left-hand slide, then kind of the situation as we've seen it recently, where the restaurants that are not only open, but as it turns out, are doing quite well at this point in terms of traffic. Not all, but most, and with the scarcity then of workers to hire. And so we have the picture here of McDonald's, which was this particular McDonald's then offering up to $3,000 per year then of scholarship money for students. Others have just offered plain cash bonuses. Others have raised their hourly rates, or some are all, a combination of all of those things then that restaurants have done to try to attract workers. And we see that shortage of workers, I mean, not only in the restaurant sector now.
So I believe we must have lost Dr. Abler there. Dave, are you able to hear me? We're not able to hear you on your end. Let's see. We'll see if Dr. Abler is able to come back on in just a moment, but it looks like he did drop off. Yeah, it looks like Dr. Abler has just exited, so hopefully he'll be able to come back into the webinar in just a moment. So we'll give him just a couple of moments to get back in, and hopefully we'll get moving on in just a moment. Dr. Abler, I see you're back in the webinar. Are you able to hear me? Okay.
Philip,
Yes,
can you hear me?
we can hear you now. Yes.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah, I have to apologize. The internet connection here is not that good, and I'm afraid you just saw an example of that. I dropped off there for a minute or two. But I'm back, and hopefully that won't happen again.
Sure thing. Sure thing.
I guess that's one other consequence. Sure, yeah. One other consequence of the pandemic, of course, then is significant growth in the demand then for internet, the amount of internet traffic, and then for folks like myself and who live in rural areas, kind of the issues with the internet then in those. Apologies there, I dropped off again. Hopefully that will not happen again. Okay, so where were we? We were talking about food service and the contrast between spring of last year and spring of this year. And then on the right-hand side, then we have a picture as of September 2020, illustrating on a state-by-state basis then the percentage of public school students attending school in person. And so Florida then at that point really was one of the exceptions in terms of having one of the highest rates then of students attending school in person. The percentages were lower in many other states, including Pennsylvania, where you had a number of students then attending in school districts then going solely then to a remote option. Some having hybrid options where students sorry, continued internet difficulties. So I was talking then about the case of Pennsylvania, where you had school districts pursuing different models in terms of whether students would attend in person at all, attend in person for full time, or some type of hybrid model involving dividing the students into groups, like a group A and a group B. One group of which attended in person a couple of days, and the other group then attending school a couple of different days in person during the school week. And of course, with all of that, then with the closures in the schools, with the closures of the restaurants, then came tremendous disruptions then in food service supply chains in all the products that were developed and directed then toward those markets. The next slide, please, Philip. Thank you. And so this figure then illustrates a bit of what happened. This is looking at monthly food service sales then for 2019, 2020, and 2021. And you can see then the compared with 2019, which showed kind of an uptick in food service sales over the summer, which is typical, and we're seeing that again this summer. And then a bit lower than in terms of food service sales during the late fall to early spring period. The tremendous drop then that occurred in the spring of last year in food service sales, dropping then from over 60 billion to about 30 billion in monthly food service sales. And it recovered then significantly over the summer, but never reached the levels that it was then at the start then of Okay, back again. Let's move to the next slide then, please, Philip. Here's a figure that illustrates what happened even more dramatically. This is data then from Open Table, which is an online restaurant reservation portal and app. And this is the percentage change then on a daily basis over the period March 2020 to July of 2021. And with the widespread closures in restaurants, traffic dropped off nearly 100% then from March to April and May of last year, and then slowly began to climb upward as states then partially reopened their economies. But then as closures, kind of reclosures took effect then in the late fall and winter period, we saw once again then a decline then in the people then dining in person in restaurants, and kind of reaching a low point then for the year 2021 in January, and climbing fairly steadily since then to the point where some days and weeks now then are above where they were in 2019. So tremendous disruptions there, which have largely recovered as travel and dining have rebounded. Okay, the next slide, please, Philip. So this slide then, I guess, is just another way of illustrating it. This is looking at monthly food service and grocery store sales. And so the grocery store sales then are the green part of these bars. And then the blue parts of the bars then represent food service sales. And so we saw then in the previous two slides, different illustrations of the way that the food service market collapsed. And so one question then that you might ask was, or would be, did the grocery stores pick up what was lost in the food service markets? And the answer is partially yes, but not entirely. Take a look at April, for example, of 2020, where you had a significant drop then in food service sales between March and April. Drop then about 55 billion, then dropping then to about 30 billion, the same figure that we saw in one of the earlier slides. But the grocery store sales then also dropped between March and April of last year. Just reflecting, I think, in part, after the stores got cleaned out in March, kind of the lack of product then to be able to restock the shelves and be able to sell things to consumers. And so the collapse in the food service market, yes, did lead to an expansion of the grocery store market, but not on a one-for-one basis by any stretch of the imagination. And grocery store sales then have remained relatively steady on a monthly basis, or did then starting in May of 2020 and running through the end of the year in December 2020. So the loss in one market was not made up for by gains in the grocery store market. Okay, next slide, please, Philip. People eat differently away from home than they do at home. And this is kind of one of the reasons why it was difficult then for farmers and food service companies, and food processors then to pivot. They did pivot, but it was difficult, in part because people just eat different types of things away from home at restaurants and at schools than they do at home. So if you look at what people eat in restaurants, they tend to eat more meat, more seafood, more cheese, products, dishes containing cheese, and more vegetables as well. In K-12 schools, compared to an at-home situation, students are drinking more milk. And if we look at that on a nutritional value basis, what we see then in food away from home, kind of on per calorie basis, more saturated fats and sodium in the kinds of foods that are eaten at restaurants, and less calcium, iron, and fiber. The exception on calcium then being the K-12 schools, where again, the students are drinking more milk, which is of course an excellent source of calcium. So that was part of the issue. People, traditionally eating different things at home than they do at restaurants and at schools. Okay, the next slide, please, Philip. Direct-to-consumer supply chains got a boost then during COVID, and a fairly big boost. As people were not able to find the products that they wanted in their local grocery store, many of them turned directly then to the farmers in their areas. And the picture in this one is a picture then of a local Amish farm in Pennsylvania, and the cheese products that they make and sell, along with things like crackers and mustard to go with the cheese. And this is based upon a 2015 study, so the data is a bit out of date. But on-farm stores then at that point, prior to COVID, were the single largest source then of direct-to-consumer sales, direct-to-consumer supply chains, followed by farmers markets and roadside stands. With community-supported agriculture, the CSAs then coming in there as well. Online sales, and this is where things have changed the most dramatically between 2015 and now. Online sales then, at that point in time, only being 6% then of total direct-to-consumer sales from farms. And I think, thank you, Philip. So yes, and so one illustration of that is data from Florida. And so the Florida Farm Bureau then, I found out, just as I was doing some work then on this presentation, and then at an event that the University of Florida organized last fall, collected data then on the number of Florida farms that are selling direct to consumers. And using something called the Internet Wayback Machine, I was able to find what that figure was like prior to, not quite prior to COVID, but early in COVID. And so in May of 2020, there were about 240 farms that were selling direct to consumers. And that number jumped then in early June, just in the course of 1 month, to about 350. And then since then has continued its growth. So as of September of last year, it was at about 370. And now, as of early July of this year, is at a little over 400. I think one question that is what have developed since COVID began. Will that continue? At current levels, or perhaps at diminished levels, but still higher than it was prior to COVID? Or will this all go away as people revert then to where they ate before? Personally, I think it's likely to have some staying power, although it won't reach, again, I think the heights that it did during the peak of COVID. Okay, Philip, the next slide, please. So what went wrong then with the food supply chains? I think it was largely then the pursuit of efficiency at the expense of resilience. And the next slide, please. Well, so prior to COVID then, the grocery store supply chains and the food service supply chains were largely distinct. So there were different farms supplying products then, which ultimately then found their way to grocery stores, versus farms that were providing products used in food service. Different processors, different processing plants, different processing companies handled those products. The products then were packaged in different sizes, and here you can see 3 examples of that. The top one then being chicken pâtés or chicken bites. The middle one then being milk, a gallon of milk in a plastic jug versus a cardboard milk carton, the kind that you would find in a school. And then on the bottom in mayonnaise, the kind on the left that you'd find in a grocery store, versus the box of mayonnaise and a plastic bag there that you would find for food service. So different sizes. And then of course with that then also different packaging. Things that are packaged for retail have to be appropriately labeled. There are food labeling laws. Labeling requirements are different for the food service markets. And so the packaging and labeling then differed as well. The next slide, please, Philip. So I want to talk a bit now then about how businesses adjusted then to the food supply chain disruptions, using some examples then from the dairy industry. So the next slide, please, Philip. So after those tremendous disruptions then, in March or April, companies. And so there was a survey then that was conducted by McKinsey, which is a management consulting group. And they surveyed dairy executives, and about 3/4 of the executive survey said that they shifted their production from food service to retail between March and April. And one other thing that then occurred with dairy processing was towards products. And so away then from milk, fresh milk, and toward things that could be stored. Even though farm prices then were trending. Back again, toward products that, that manufacturers could store and then hopefully sell later at good prices, bulk cheeses, butter, milk powder, and whey powder. Okay, next slide, please, Philip. One other thing that changed during COVID was the search then for new demand outlets. And so dairy exports then grew about 9% then in 2020, providing an additional outlet then for dairy products, continuing the growth that had happened since 2017. And I'm not sure that all of that is due to COVID, or even most of that 9% was due to COVID, but it was kind of a fortuitous trend occurring at the same time as COVID that relieved then some pressure on the dairy market. And then during the pandemic, then food processors, dairy processors made donations to food banks throughout the country. So Dairy Farmers of America, which is a large dairy cooperative, for example, donated milk, cheese, cottage cheese. And here we have a picture then illustrating just a box of food items available for distribution at a food bank. Okay, the next slide, please, Philip. Food processors and excuse me, dairy processors in particular then also worked on improving their collaboration with supply chain partners. And improved communication then about where demand trends were kind of at each stage of the supply chain, so that food processors then would have a better idea kind of what was happening at the retail level in terms of the demand for their products, and so that they could adjust kind of what was being produced, where it was being produced, where it was being distributed to during the course of the pandemic. These types of collaborations, of course, have always existed, but they were prior to COVID largely ad hoc in nature, and they became more formal than during COVID. And an example of that is Land O'Lakes, a large dairy cooperative, which used something called Forkite software to provide them real-time shipment visibility. So they were able to see in real time where their shipments were on a map and in their in by stage of supply chain. And it also then enabled them to help reduce empty miles and relieve some of the pressure on the trucking industry that occurred during COVID. Empty miles occur when a truck goes out not fully loaded, or it might go out partially or fully loaded and then comes back empty. Those are empty miles. Okay, The next slide, please, Philip. So this is some research then that some colleagues at Penn State worked upon using something called a multi-layer network model, which then captures kind of flows of products and services then across sectors of the economy and locations in the economy. And so you have then in the figure on the right here, different maps showing then different locations in the United States. And then each layer of that map then represents a different industry. And so you have product then flowing from one industry in one part of the country to a different industry in a different part of the country. And those flows then represent the movements of products and services through supply chains. And one thing that a model like this can do then is look at what happens if there are shocks to supply or shocks to demand in different industries, in different locations of the country, and how those shocks then propagate along supply chains. Next slide, please, Philip. And out of that then, you can obtain then insight into the level of fragility then of different sectors of the economy. The fragility level then being the possibility that a small failure kind of at one node or in one location could lead then to a large avalanche then of failures in supply chains, either upstream or downstream from the point where the failure occurs. And for an example of that, think about the closure of a meat plant. And that closure then leading to large disruptions upstream or downstream in meat supply chains. And then also then fragility risk, which is the interaction then between the level of fragility and then the extent of the exposure then of that industry then to supply and demand shocks. How common are they? And the highest levels then of fragility risk turned out to be coming out of this model then largely agricultural products and food products. So animal feed, food manufacturing, live animals, meat, milled grains, tobacco products, all sectors that using data assembled prior to COVID had high levels of fragility. With others then exhibiting median levels of fragility, such as fruits and vegetables and grains and fertilizers. So in retrospect, perhaps we should not, taking a look at these results here, I think they help illustrate then some of the problems that occurred during COVID. And, had we examined this and had we known a bit more about what might happen during a pandemic, these types of results, they might have been useful then. Okay, I'm back again. Sorry about that, everybody. This has got to set a record for a webinar in terms of the number of drop connections, and I apologize about that. Okay, let's move on to the next slide, please, Philip. Other research that I was involved in then was a survey of Pennsylvania dairy farms. And so we sent the survey electronically and by paper then to all of the dairy farms that we knew of in Pennsylvania. 588 active dairy farms responded to the questionnaire. And what we wanted to find out was whether dairy farms that invest in sustainability practices, are they more resilient? And if so, do the resilience benefits of sustainability practices differ between farms depending on farm size and the gender of the farm operator? Okay, the next slide, please, Philip. The main results then in terms of resilience turned out that dairy farms that invest in sustainability practices are more resilient. We found that they're more likely to continue in business or to have an emergency plan in place or both. And we think that's because these farms then, in the process of implementing sustainability practices, learn to be more forward-thinking and adaptable. We also found that larger farms get a bigger boost to resilience from investing in sustainability practices than small farms. So this benefit then of investing in these practices favors the larger farms over the smaller ones. And we also found that farms operated by women get a bigger resilience boost than from investing in sustainability practices than farms that are operated by men. Okay, the next slide, please, Philip. Some other results that we found that I guess we thought were interesting. Only 5% of the farmers that were surveyed have daily communication with their farm workers, and only 9% conduct annual performance reviews. And I think these are farms that are largely, with respect to daily communication with their farm workers, turning that over then either to a farm manager if they have one, or they're just not communicating with their farm workers. We found that farms that employ a nutritionist are more likely to stay in business. We also found that farms that have a succession plan in place know what's going to happen to the farm then when the farm owner decides to retire. Those are more likely to stay in business. And also that farms that have a longer business relationship with their cooperative then are more likely to stay in business as well. And so developing then and maintaining that relationship with the farm's cooperative turned out to be important. Okay, the next slide, please, Philip. So what are some lessons learned then about food supply chains from COVID? The next slide, please, Philip. I think for food supply chains in general, I think there was an old classification of the food industry as a functional category. If you were to look at a textbook on supply chains or read the things that were published, at least by academics about supply chains, academics and consultants prior to COVID, you'd find the food industry classified as functional, meaning the industry with stable demand and very little demand uncertainty. That's how they saw the food industry. And I think that old classification is dead now. COVID killed it off. Another lesson learned, I think, is that resilience then needs to take its place. There's a great emphasis then on the pursuit of efficiency, kind of in the 20 years prior to COVID, not only in food supply chains, but in supply chains generally. And then more recently, sustainability then has become important then for food supply chains. But resilience needs to be up there as well. So it's a three-legged stool rather than just two legs, with resilience being the third leg. And then some of what we saw then with Land O'Lakes, for example, in the DFA involving communication and collaboration efforts with supply partners, that should be formalized and extended so that there's better information sharing along supply chains. That can get a little bit touchy because then people are sharing business information that they might view as proprietary, but they need to let their supply chain partners know where they're at so that their partners then can meet their needs. Next slide, please, Philip. For food companies, I think one lesson learned, I think, is to diversify supply chains to a broader range of suppliers and locations and away from a single source or location. So relying on a single meat processing plant, for example, or relying largely on a single dairy processing plant may not be the best way to go. Better to have a wider portfolio then of suppliers and locations. Maintaining larger inventories of storable food products. One of the things that happened in the 20 years prior to COVID in the pursuit of efficiency then was the minimization of inventories and the idea of just-in-time delivery. And I think COVID illustrated what can go wrong then with that. And then maintaining the flexibility that was developed during COVID-19 to shift between the grocery and food service markets. This isn't necessarily the end of COVID or the end of pandemics or other things that may disrupt food supply chains. And so flexibility then is a good thing. Next slide, please, Philip. And then for agriculture, I think the results, and you're drawing on the survey that we did then at Pennsylvania dairy farms, to have a risk management strategy then against a wide variety of risks. Something like COVID was probably not on anybody's radar screen prior to it, but it should be now. And the kinds of risks that that entails, the risks that markets might not be there. The dumping of milk then being an example of that. And then I think the second lesson is that resilience is all about adaptability and finding ways to become more adaptable. And so as we found then in that survey of Pennsylvania dairy farms, one way that that can happen then is by adopting and implementing a sustainability plan. And then third, as I mentioned earlier, I think local food is going to build on its gains during COVID-19 and become kind of a more important part of the food landscape than it was prior to COVID. And so with that, next slide, please, Philip. Thank you. Thank you for being here today. Thank you for putting up with the many drops in the connection on my end.
Well, thank you so much, Dr. Oh, sorry. Yeah, I was just gonna
go ahead.
I was just also gonna say what you were saying is, yeah, you have questions. You can type those in the chat box at this time. We still have just a few minutes left, so we could take, maybe 1 or 2 or 3 questions. So once again, just type those in the chat box, and Dr. Abler will be able to address those if you have any. Yeah, we'll give you a minute just to do that. Of course, you can see Dr. Abler's email up there if you'd like to contact him outside of this as well. And also, I want to say that, of course, we all understand internet connectivity issues. I think we've all been there. So thank you so much, Dr. Abler, for kind of working through that and getting through the presentation. But we all understand that for sure. So once again, if you have those questions, go ahead and type those in now.
Hey, thank you, Kelly, for your chat comment. It's a pleasure to be here with you today. Then a question from Alan Wyman. Alan, I hope I'm pronouncing your last name correctly. And his question is, how is the retail end of the food supply chain affected by COVID-19? I think early in the pandemic, as we saw from the pictures that I showed during my presentation, initially at least, then there was kind of a destocking of food supply of grocery store shelves as consumers then bought up all manner of storable food products and storable paper products, as well as then cleaned out many of the fresh products, such as the picture that I put up then of the milk then, which was largely sold out. So there was that problem then that occurred early in COVID. And then a bit later on the meat supply side, then the loss in product due to the meat plant closures then in mid to late spring of last year. And by and large then, the retail end has recovered since then, but did not then, as I also mentioned, did not pick up the loss in sales that occurred in the food service markets. The retail end held its own in terms of total sales, but did not pick up kind of the lost business on the food service side. And then a question then from Lee, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, Lee Nguyen. The question being, what is the impact or impacts of the immigrated labor restriction during COVID on the U.S. dairy industry? Yeah, that's a good question, and one that I didn't touch on in my presentation. So yeah, immigrant labor has become very important to the dairy industry. And I think a majority then of dairy farm workers in most states now are immigrant workers. And with the restrictions then on labor, then restrictions then on movement of workers, workers coming into the United States, both legally and perhaps illegally, and I think then put more pressure on the dairy industry to be able to supply the milk then that people were demanding then at the retail level. But with the loss at the same time of the food service markets, which were important markets for dairy products, I think that loss in demand then, I think somewhat cushion is perhaps not the right word, but it meant that the loss of labor was not as big of an issue as it might have been because the demand just wasn't there then for the dairy products early in the pandemic. And then lastly, then a question from an anonymous attendee: with another round of COVID coming quickly, it seems to me that we may face the same issues. I think it seems too early for the industry to have taken the kinds of steps you outlined to increase resiliency. And what is your perspective on this? Yeah, and I think the industry has taken some of the steps that I talked about, but certainly there are others that have a ways to go. And so we saw the dairy processors then pivoting in March and April of last year away from the food service market and toward the retail market. But yes, the kinds of things that I'm talking about are things that are probably on a 5-year timeline in many cases, rather than a 5-week or 1-month timeline. So I agree with you. I mean, resilience is still an issue and will continue to be an issue. As we've seen in the restaurants this summer with the growth that has occurred then in recovery in restaurant business, being accompanied at the same time by a shortage of people to work then in those restaurants.